When I decided to take the scores off of my tasting notes got so much better. Because I couldn't just say blackcurrant, tobacco, pencil shavings, 95, right? When you don't have a numerical score associated with that note, you need to use the power of language to tell people how good it is, how unique it is. Why is it profound?
Hello, this is Uncorking What's Next, the podcast where we sit down with people shaping the future of wine. I'm your host, Jeff Zacharia, and today we're talking with someone who spent decades helping people discover wine, not from the château, not as a wine critic, and not in the wine trade, but from pure passion and an Instagram account called An Englishman's Claret. Marc Bouffard has built a remarkable career as a wine writer, communicator, educator, and influencer. Along the way, he's watched the industry change dramatically from the rise of critics to social media to today's challenges of attracting an entirely new generation of wine drinkers. He's also the author of an exciting new book, Saint-Julien, exploring one of Bordeaux's greatest appellations. Welcome to Uncorking What's Next. Let's get into it. Today's episode is brought to you by La Tête d'Or, the French-American steakhouse from legendary chef Daniel Boulud in Manhattan's Flatiron District, serving one of the best lunches in New York. I had the pleasure of working with Chef Boulud over the years, hosting wine auctions together at Restaurant Daniel and dining at many of his amazing restaurants. I've never been disappointed. So I was very excited to see what he's created at La Tête d'Or. It brings together the spirit of classic American steakhouse with refined French flair. Great steaks, incredible seafood, and a fantastic wine list. If you're in New York and looking for a memorable lunch, La Tête d'Or is absolutely worth a visit. It gets my highest recommendation. Marc, welcome to Uncorking What's Next.
Jeff, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. I've been enjoying the podcast so much as a consumer, so it's a particular treat to be on as a guest.
Oh, thank you so much. And so I'll just come back and say how much I've enjoyed watching you on Instagram and watching your career grow along those lines. It's really been a pleasure as well.
Thank you. That's really kind. It's such a nice thing to share with people. And it came from an unexpected genesis. My wife actually suggested back in 2016 that I join Instagram. And at first I said, no, I don't like social media that much.
And we'll get into all that, but I'd love to start going back further than that about, when you were growing up. Did both your parents work outside the home?
They both are business owners. They both worked inside the home in that way. So it was a really interesting juxtaposition of having parents who worked, but also parents who were accessible and around all the time. It was really a wonderful way to grow up.
And was wine part of your life when you were growing up?
It was, yeah. My dad has always been interested in wine, and his best friend is really an extraordinary collector, and in the 1970s really became interested in the wines of France, in particular Bordeaux and Burgundy, and the wines of California. So when he came to dinner, these things were around. They were part of the atmosphere.
And that's how wine should be learned and discovered, right? That's the best way along those lines.
Absolutely.
And then, but wine is not your career. What did you study in college?
I was a biology major at Tufts, and I went on to medical school at Tufts, and I'm a practicing physician. So wine is very much, despite having a book about it, still sort of a passion on the side.
Interesting. And as we talked earlier, you heard the conversation with Laura Catena, who was a practicing physician, and then now wine's become her full-time career. And I have to say, I've really been looking forward to this interview because I've spent 40 years in the world of wine at auction, in retail, in cellars, in Bordeaux. And I've rarely come across someone who's built the kind of trust and access that you have without a formal role in the trade. So let's just start right there. As you started to say earlier, how did all this begin?
Well, I've really been blessed to sort of be in the right place at the right time. There were a couple of things that I think started me on the path to writing this book. And, also sort of my presence on Instagram in parallel with that. In 2016 or 2017, so pretty shortly after I joined Instagram, I opened up a 1966 Léoville Barton. And I got a note, a private message from Damian Barton Sartorius. It said, "Dear sir, we're looking forward to the 200th anniversary of Léoville Barton being in my family. We're trying to collect bottles that end in 6. Do you have one that I could buy from you?" And I felt so badly because it was the only bottle that I had. No, I mean, and if I had one, I wouldn't sell it to you. I'd just give it to you. I'd visited with my dad a few years prior, and we had a wonderful time and just had always loved the wine. So I went looking for a bottle of the 1966 to send them. And I happened to have a contact in the UK who had a bottle that looked like it was in really good shape. So I sent him a note and asked him to send this bottle to the Bartons in Saint-Julien. And he said, "Oh, well, that's really interesting. So why are you sending it there?" And I told him the story. And he said, "I can't take your money. I visited with my wife 30 years ago. The people were so nice." So, on the one hand, I think a lot of people think about Bordeaux as this faraway place that's not always accessible or relatable, but that's so often not true, right? I mean, these were people to whom I could not give a gift. They were so well loved. So, that was sort of the way that I got to know the Barton Sartorius family. And a few years later, I think it was in 2018, I'd managed to find some Ducru-Beaucaillou. I've always been a fan of Ducru-Beaucaillou. And I had a little vertical going back to 1929.
Wow.
And some of it, yeah, right. I mean, there's just wines that are not around in quantity anymore. So I sent a note to the château, again, via Instagram, saying, "Look, I have these wines. You may not," because, a lot of châteaux don't actually have stock in their own cellars going back that far. I since learned that Ducru-Beaucaillou does, but I didn't know that at the time. So I asked if they'd like to send someone from the château, if anyone wanted to taste this. It'd be a pleasure to host them. And they replied and said, "Oh, yes, well, someone would like to come. It's Monsieur Borie who'd like to come." And then that was the start of a really wonderful friendship with Bruno Borie. So it's a very long-winded sort of explanation to your question about how someone who didn't come into writing a book like this from a background as a wine professional, managed to have that access. And it was really through the conversations with the Barton Sartorius family, with Bruno Borie, that made me think that the things that I got to learn about are things that most wine lovers would really like to learn about, and that hadn't been written, right? So, like a lot of happy authors, I got to write the book that I wanted to read, but they didn't exist.
Amazing. But you started your Instagram account based on your wife's encouragement in 2016?
Yeah.
What was your thinking? What was your goal at that point? Why were you doing it?
Oh, there was no goal. I was just doing it to have fun. I never started the Instagram account with the idea of amassing followers or somehow drawing interest to myself. My wife, Alex, had suggested that, you might meet people who you like. You like to talk to them about wine. There are people, there are hobbyists like yourself. And at first I said, but I have friends in real life. I have people I actually see. Why would I want to talk to people, on the internet?
Yeah.
Right. But kind of in the way that I think there was a generation of ham radio lovers, I think Instagram, particularly at that time in the sort of mid 2010s, it was this really, and still is to a large extent, but was then in particular, I think, just a really beautiful avenue for people who are passionate hobbyists about whatever to connect with each other.
And was there a breakout moment where you realized people were actually listening and paying attention to you?
Well, it really kind of came gradually. There was a point in time when Reels came out, and I kind of figured, well, I don't know, let's get behind the camera. Let's see how it goes. And I had so much fun with it. And it was really nice to connect with people. And, as the following grew, then I started to think, well, if there are this many people interested in what I'm interested in, then maybe I should write a book.
And so how did the name come up, Englishman's Claret? Where did that come from?
Yeah, no. Sometimes people get so confused when I meet them. They say, but you're not English.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. So I spent one of my years in college at Oxford from 2006 to 2007. And so, for people who weren't around at the time interested in wine, it was actually a time of great schism. So the 2003s really sort of divided opinion. There was a group of wine critics who really loved sort of the riper, bigger styles that were coming out, and some people who disliked them. And sometimes that dialogue was colorful. So I remember, and it came up somehow, like someone said at a tasting, because I tasted a lot at Oxford, and that was actually one of the things that transitioned sort of a background interest, something that was lovely to have at the dinner table, into something that was an academic interest. But someone, had said, as I was talking about what I liked, oh, well, you don't have an American palate. you have, which I think still is a silly thing. I don't think that there's an American palate or anything like that. There should be diversity. It's good, not bad. But someone said, well, you like an Englishman's Claret. And when I started my Cellar Tracker account in, 2007, 2008, what am I going to write down for mine? I didn't want to use my own name. So I thought, Englishman's Claret. And then it just sort of stuck.
That's great. And it has stuck. And and I totally agree. One of the beauties to me of wine is just how diverse it is, right? And how people in the United States and in Europe, you have all these... wine is about what you make of it, what you love. That's the beauty of it. There's no right or wrong.
I agree. That's one of the things that I really try to tell people on Instagram. Sometimes people, I think in a way, look to a very famous critic and pick your critic, right? I mean, people do this with different people and they say, okay, that person is right. Why did you disagree?
Yeah. Yeah.
À chacun son goût, right?
Yeah, oui, c'est ça. Exactement. Oui, c'est ça, exactement. And everyone has their own experience with wine, which is what makes it so wonderful. One of my early interviews was with Jermaine Stone. Do you know him?
No, I haven't had the pleasure.
He's someone who built a remarkable wine community almost from nothing through authentic storytelling and just being who he was. And what struck me about his story was that his audience found him. He was not chasing them. Is that your experience as well?
Yes, very, very much so. I was surprised, actually, as surprised as anyone. I've always just gotten in front of the camera and talked about what I thought was interesting, the things that surprised me, the things that I wanted to learn about, and it just sort of followed.
Right. And Jermaine, you should either check him out or look at my interview with him, because he's bringing wine and hip hop together. And it's super interesting. And it's great. It's another way to just increase the tent of people who are enjoying wine. So I love what you're doing, and I love what he's doing as well.
Yeah, I think that's great.
And it's interesting because social media has given you and wine a platform that there wasn't before. But to me, what I wonder about social media is there's also a lot of noise and a lot of flashy content in there. And what do you think about that tension, and how do you navigate that?
I think that it's probably a good thing to have something for everybody. And, the reels that I do sometimes can be quite technical. Sometimes they're deep cuts. Admittedly, a lot of it isn't sort of Bordeaux 101. But I don't think there's anything wrong with Bordeaux 101 being out there. I don't think there's anything wrong with, things that are really a deeper dive, maybe a little more esoteric being out there. There are so many people who I talk to who come to wine through different avenues. And it's a good thing. I think that people who've sort of followed my path are maybe even nowadays the minority. People who grew up with wine around and sort of came to it from some of the classic wine regions like Bordeaux and Burgundy, at least in the United States. I think that it's probably a good and healthy thing for the industry that there are an increasing number of avenues toward a common goal that's infinitely customizable.
Yeah, you're doing one end, and I guess me in a long format is doing a very different end of the same kind of a thing. We're both trying to reach out and share our passion and love for wine. What I wonder about, though, is the next generation. You've built a great audience on Instagram, and I suspect most people who follow you, and maybe I'm wrong, are people who already know a lot about wine. how do we reach out to people who don't know that much about wine, but might have an interest towards it?
It's interesting because I think it's really mixed. There are definitely a lot of people who are very sophisticated wine lovers who follow me on Instagram. And I know that just because of the comments that they post, right? But there's also, I think, a large group of people who are just getting into it. And sometimes the questions are at a more basic level. And, I don't mean to say that with a negative connotation, because I actually really like the fact that, and I mean, as any teacher will say, I think you never know anything so well as when you try to explain it to someone who doesn't know about it. Right. And I think that it's really nice to have that mix of followers. And I do try to talk to everybody. And I think it's also really nice, too, for people who are unfamiliar with some more advanced concepts in wine to hear about it in passing. Because if they're interested, then they latch onto that and they leave a comment. They say, what are you talking about? Can you tell me more about that? Or they'll go Google it, right? They'll look it up. They'll learn about it on their own. And if those things aren't sort of routinely part of a public discourse about wine, then it just doesn't land on the radar of your non-super sophisticated wine consumer. So I think that information sort of has to be out there. It has to be sort of floating around in the ether as something that someone might just stumble upon who's new to wine. And if they choose to engage with that and dive deep, that's great. And if they don't, that's great. That's also fine.
It's just like wine itself. Some people want to become very nerdy about it, and others just want to cover it in a very light form. One comment I recently got about my podcast is, sometimes I talk about something that me and the person I'm talking to fully understand, but some of the audience doesn't. So as you spent 20 years or longer doing this, just 2016, so 10 years, do you feel that we're winning or losing in getting new people into wine?
Winning. No doubt about it.
Tell me more.
I have no doubt about that. And, particularly I think in the realm of Bordeaux, sometimes you hear these things like, oh, it's not fashionable. Oh, no one young buys Bordeaux. I think we first met at the Union des Grands Crus tasting in New York.
Yes.
And, every single year, I've been going to the UGC tasting. The first one I attended, I think, was in 2017.
What is the Union des Grands Crus tasting? Because some people might not know what that is.
So there's this wonderful trade organization in Bordeaux, the Union des Grands Crus. And it's not only the 1855 Grand Cru Classé, right? It's a group of chateaux, including many of the Grand Cru Classé, but also some wonderful Cru Bourgeois, some people from the right bank, Pomerol, which has no classification, Saint-Emilion, which has a classification that changes, Sauternes and Barça. Yeah, I know. That's a different podcast, right? That one's sometimes a little thorny to deal with, I think, for people like you and me. And so every year they come around with the most recently bottled wines, or they're, not yet released to the general public, but they're about to be. So we go around and taste all of these beautiful wines. And, there's the trade tasting, which, some people who listen to or watch the podcast will go to, but it's also open to the public. And that's such a wonderful thing for the public.
Tasting. Right. It's a separate tasting.
It's a separate tasting.
Right.
The trade portion, the public portion. And every year I'm surprised by the number of young people in the room. The public tasting is not full of people who are in their, 50s and 60s wearing suits and ties and, quietly shuffling around from one producer to another. I mean, it's a party atmosphere.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that it's not educational. It actually really is, but it's full of young people. And when I look at my own followers, one of the things that Instagram does that I think is very useful is breaks down your followers, the people with whom you engage. Who's your audience? Where are they located? What's the gender distribution? What's the age distribution? And there are a huge number of people who are in that sort of under 35 bracket who follow me on Instagram. So to your question of, are we winning in getting new people interested in wine? Yes. I mean, from where I sit, from my vantage point, the number of people who I see really meaningfully engaging with Bordeaux, both in person at tastings like the UGC and also on Instagram, is a really robust population. I'm so glad to see it. Bordeaux, it's important. It's important for the fabric of any wine region. I think all the more so for ones that really have this history of connoisseurship, as, ideas about connoisseurship to some extent change.
I was thrilled to see at the UGC tasting some of the younger people, but I think Bordeaux still has a perception problem where people still look at it, oh, that was the wine my father used to drink. They want to go to other areas. They don't want to taste Bordeaux. Do you see some of that as well?
I think there's some of that too. I think that, Jeff, the older we get, the more we begrudgingly accept that our fathers actually knew something. That happens.
Yes.
So that's not to be discounted either. But, I actually don't think that that's fundamentally a problem for Bordeaux. Bordeaux is, in the public imagination, still dominated by some very excellent but very expensive wines, your first growth, so on and so forth.
Right.
But particularly over the past decade, there has never been such a uniformly high standard of winemaking in Bordeaux. And the value that comes with that is absolutely extraordinary. So I think that when you think about the most attractive regions for value, I'm not saying this as, a PR person for Bordeaux. Nobody's paying me for better or worse, right? But the value is so extraordinary. So for young people, Bordeaux is there to welcome them. And, I think that does need to be talked about a little bit more. To your point about the reputation evolving a little bit, I agree that has to happen, but the wine doesn't need to evolve. The wine is there, the prices are there. And I think that particularly as people become more cosmopolitan and the wine world becomes a wider place, there's nothing to be afraid of. I think it's interesting and really helps people to find their place when they're able to taste a wonderful wine from Chile, from Argentina, from Italy. And there's no one road to a particular wine region. And I think that although some people worry about, a set market where on average consumers may be drinking less than they used to, and where does the market share go? And, I think there's a lot of reasonable and kind of interesting economics behind those questions. As people really think about value, they will sort of swing back a little bit more to Bordeaux. Every pendulum swings, and the only thing you can count on is that fashions will change.
Yeah, right? Yeah. And it's interesting because I'm a board member of NAWR, National Association of Wine Retailers. And so twice a year we get together and discuss all kinds of stuff. And I was on a panel just recently about Bordeaux, because throughout the country, there's still that perception that you talked about earlier about it expensive and it's the first gross. And by the way, I totally agree with you. I think there's a huge opportunity of great Bordeaux out there, reasonable prices, there's a lot of exciting things going on. To me, it's really a communication and PR problem more than any, or challenge, we'll say, more than anything, right?
Yeah, I'm so astounded, particularly now that Bordeaux drinks well at a younger age, which is fascinating. And I think sometimes people very cynically say, oh, well, the Bordelais are trying to tap into that young market. I don't know if they are or they aren't, but in viticultural terms, the answer for that is not some wizardry that is happening in Bordeaux to make the wines accessible at an earlier age. And, I'm happy to talk about that too. It's a fascinating and longer conversation. But this is simply a byproduct of precision viticulture and vinification. And, it's not like some trick. And I don't think that, it'll come at the expense of longevity.
No, I don't think so. And what to me is exciting about many regions in the world, but certainly in Bordeaux as well, the top vintages, because of viticulture improvements, have improved a little bit. It's the tougher vintages that have really come up in quality, in my view, so that you don't have the really challenging vintages that we used to have in the past.
It's absolutely the case. I mean, when I was a kid, I don't know if it was the same for you. I remember my dad telling me, well, 2 vintages in 10 will be great in Bordeaux.
Yeah.
And of course, you get these outlier decades, right? You get your 1920s, 1940s, 1950s, and things like that. But even in the 60s, Okay, on the left bank anyway, in the Médoc, of course you had your 61, and then, did you have another truly top of them? No, not really. Did the 70s have any in the Médoc? No, not really, But nowadays, I agree with you. Not only do we have more vintages that really are, top tier vintages, but you just don't run into so many 1965s, 1963s, exactly. 1968s, it just doesn't. Yeah.
I was lucky enough to be born in 61, so I've enjoyed many great 61s in my day. Hi, listener. I'm looking to grow my show. And if you like this episode, I'd ask you to think of one person in your life who'd also really enjoy listening to it. And if so, would you please share it with them? I really appreciate you spreading the word and sharing. Let's find other people who are as excited about this as you are. One other big challenge in Bordeaux right now is just the en primeur system. You do talk about in your book, but there's a lot of concern that this is a system that isn't going to be viable in 5 or 10 years. And I don't know if you have thoughts on that and where that stands at this point.
It's an interesting discussion. I have a lot of thoughts on it. I think that, the concerns about EP not working go back decades, right?
Yes,
people have always been waiting for that Mark Twain quote, right? The rumors of my demise are exaggerated, something along those lines.
Hi, listeners. A quick interruption to explain what the en primeur system is, as people call it. They call it the EP system. In Bordeaux, for certainly the 40 years I've been in the business, but for much longer, the chateaux, they pick their wines in the fall, they harvest in the fall. In the spring, the trade comes and tastes the wine, and then a month or so later, the chateaux start releasing prices for the wines to the Bordeaux negociants, who then sell it on to the trade, who sell it on to the consumers. It's a practice that is exclusively done in Bordeaux in such volume, and for many years it worked really well because the prices were really the best prices that you'd see if you bought the wine en primeur. That's not always the case these days, and so there certainly are many people questioning whether this practice is still a practice to continue on or not.
But yes, in principle, I think that it's healthy for everybody to recognize what the limitations are and how the system could be improved upon. I think that it's a challenging thing when, the release for a vintage is purchased by the négociant and not sold on directly to a retailer and a consumer. How long can some négociant carry some of these wines, particularly if they're using credit to finance the purchase of these things, and with interest rates rising and prices, sometimes sort of struggling to click with consumers. I do think that it's certainly something that, for the good of the ecosystem, needs to be attended to. And, there are so many chateaux. There are very, very few chateaux who, like Latour, for example, have just said, oh, no problem, we don't need EP. We don't need that revenue stream. We don't need that sort of, ease of distribution. We'll take care of it. So, there are a lot of people who make great wine, who are really hardworking, who do depend on the en primeur system, both for, their fiscal solvency and also for the ease of not having a whole group of people that they have just for that chateau to handle something the négociant handles. But they're also very savvy, and the system of the négociant and the chateau and the courtier who help to mediate that process, everybody knows what's going on. So, I think that it's reasonable and defensible and okay for us to, call attention to some of the difficulties with the system. It's not news to people. I do think that in 2025, there were some really sharp deals with en primeur that actually made sense. And so I think where EP really makes sense is when you look at a comparable vintage and, the past 5 to 10 years. And if your en primeur offers a substantial discount to anything that's currently on the market that's getting close to being mature, that makes sense to buy. And, it's a different question. I don't think, the people should be buying en primeur to try and have some financial appreciation so they can turn around and flip it and things like, I think there's some unhealthy things that can also happen in wine economics that are probably not good for the system as a whole. And actually, I think there are a lot of cases where that probably isn't the right financial move, where you look at what you could do, with that capital elsewhere. But, you look at Ducru-Beaucaillou and Lafite this past year. I think that their en primeur releases were very attractively priced.
Right.
When you look at, even other vintages that are sharply priced for what they are. You look at your 2020s and, things along those lines. So I do think that the proportion of châteaux that released en primeur in 2025 at a price which, even if it wasn't an obvious definitely buy, like Lafite and Ducru-Beaucaillou, I think the number of people whose pricing is going in a really reasonable direction compared to what's on the market from 5 to 7 years old, I think it's a good signal. We talked about pendulum swinging with taste, and I'm hopeful that the pendulum will swing in a way that really makes it a sustainable financial ecosystem for all of the people who benefit. Because when it works, it actually benefits everybody in the chain. It can benefit the consumer, the chateau, the négociant, courtier, all at the same time.
Yeah, very true. I've been in the futures business, the EP business for 40 years. We used to sell so much because, we were happy to keep half of it back and not sell it because we knew it would appreciate in a year or two and it made sense. These days, most vintages, we're just buying what we sell, right? It's a very different world out there. And I could see a world where chateaus begin to transition to a more, not Latour totally where they hold it all back, but maybe they sell 20 or 30% on Premier, and then they continue to sell more on, later on release. And if they can, they have a cash flow issue and they have to manage that and, have enough cash flow to justify, to balance it all. But if you keep enough bottles back, and you start selling some mature bottles, I think there's a way maybe to transition to a different world. Because certainly EP is not working as it used to work 10, 15, 20 years ago. And there's been a lot of pushback.
I think your point is exactly right. And I talked to a lot of people in Bordeaux who are doing exactly that. And the proportions are different. But, chateau that used to keep maybe 5% of their stock, oftentimes chateau are keeping more. Right. And oftentimes it's for the good of building a cellar at the chateau and having that stock for tastings and things like that. But there is an element of that for a lot of people, I think, that come into the ex-chateau releases, which, as and which, a lot of listeners and viewers will know, are often very popular and really command a premium from that beautiful provenance.
Right. And that's meaningful. And many times when we sell things ex-chateau, 10, 15 years old, either at auction or retail, there's a class of people who totally search for those wines because they have the confidence of the provenance. Another real dividing point are scores and ratings. And I know you made the deliberate choice in your book not, and maybe in general, not to do scores. How did you make that decision?
It was a hard one. And, I thought at first that I would put scores in. Because on Cellar Tracker, I generally put a score on something. I wrote a piece for Decanter, which was a ton of fun about value among the Grand Cru Classé. And there were scores on that too. And so if people really want to find the scores are out there. But when I wrote the book, I really kind of got to thinking that the purpose of the book was to tell the story of the chateau and to give the reader the experience of having the chance to visit the place, to talk to the technical director, to talk to the owner, to learn about what they're thinking. And I sort of felt like putting a score on the tasting notes. They're tasting notes for all of these things, because I think that's constructive. I think that being able to talk about these wines from very young to very old and everything in between really helps to give the reader a sense of the personality of the wines, the uniqueness of the place. And Bordeaux really is a place of terroir just as much as any other place. So when I thought about putting the scores on, it sort of felt like I was interjecting my own bias into it, or my own thoughts a little too strongly. I think that it sort of got in the way of the reader forming his or her own opinions and relating to the chateau, because so many of us, I mean, even if we read the note, your eye is drawn to a score. You can't help it.
Yeah.
So I think that in that way, it allows the reader a little more freedom and a little more opportunity. Not to say, and I mean, a lot of people consider me kind of a strict scorer. It's just who I am. I have my own internal system and I stick to it. And I think there's a coherence to that. And, it's fine. I think it's useful. I think I like my way of doing that. But, I don't want somebody to look at a score and say, 91 points, not interested, will not read farther. You should read farther. And in addition, I'll say that when I decided to take the scores off of my tasting notes got so much better. Because I couldn't just say blackcurrant, tobacco, pencil shavings, 95, right? When you don't have a numerical score associated with that note, you need to use the power of language to tell people how good it is, how unique it is. Why is it profound? Why is it sometimes lacking? How does it have those challenges? And I think that sort of the texture and depth of the tasting notes actually got a lot more sophisticated when I needed to relate that impression of levels of goodness without just popping a score on and moving on.
I like that. That's great. I hadn't thought about that because when I was sharing my notes from Zacky's, I would never put the score in either. I just kept that for myself because same reason. I just feel the scores really, they can be a distraction. So that's really interesting. So let's just uncork the book itself. It's a beautiful book. I'll just show it here on the screen for people. I loved reading it. Now, I don't read that many wine books, but I really enjoyed this one. Well done indeed. And you chose Saint-Julien as your first volume. Why start with Saint-Julien?
Well, first of all, thank you so much. I'm really glad you enjoyed the book. And I was also so pleased when I actually received the first preprint hard copy, which, I mean, you think about these things, it's something like 135,000 words. And for years, this thing existed in my head and in a series of Word documents. And I took many of the photos myself, and I am not a pro photographer.
Wow. And they're beautiful photos. They're beautiful.
Thank you so much. It was a beautiful camera and Lightroom. It's not my own talent by and large. I'm, really pleased about the way it's come out. And so much of that is down to the Académie du Vin Library and the beautiful job that they did. So I started with Saint-Julien because I had these connections with some of the people in Saint-Julien, with the Barton Sartorius family, with Bruno Borie. And it was on the basis of some of those experiences and conversations that I really got to thinking, there's a book in this. This is something that people are going to want to read. And so, it felt right to start in Saint-Julien. It didn't feel right to say, hey, this is such a great idea. Let me go first to Pauillac. I think a lot of people have said, well, why didn't you start with an appellation that had first growths? There's still this sort of glitz and glamour to that, which I totally understand. But Saint-Julien, has been meaningful to me, not just by virtue of the deep friendships that I have with some of the people there, but also with the deep love that I've always had for the wines. There's this old adage that Saint-Julien manages to marry some of the power of Pauillac with some of the elegance and beauty of Margaux. And I think that's totally true. And for me, it doesn't make Saint-Julien sort of a less than. For me, it sort of makes it an archetype. It's sort of like the center, the archetypal Bordeaux. I think sometimes, if you were inviting someone to your home who said, Jeff, I've read about Bordeaux. I love wines from other places. I've just never had a really great classic Bordeaux. What would you pull for them? If someone came to me with that, it would probably be a Saint-Julien.
I can totally see that. And I remember you also called Saint-Julien the unsung hero of Bordeaux. What does that actually mean to you?
People fixate so much on the 1855 classification. And for anyone who's not familiar with this, as old as time, people have been saying, well, who's better than, which neighbor and so on and so forth? What's a ranking? How do we organize this? In 1855, there was a World's Fair in Paris. Napoleon III tasked the Bordeaux Chamber of Commerce to have some ranking system so that people who did not know Bordeaux with great familiarity could come to the World's Fair and understand the pecking order. And so the Chamber of Dewey Markham, the late Dewey Markham, has a beautiful book about this, which I encourage everybody to pick up if they haven't. And, the Chamber of Commerce said to the courtier, well, this might be a little hairy. It's a potential for some feathers to fly. So the 1855 classification was really a classification that was just sort of a structure built on what your average price was for a number of years preceding the ranking. It wasn't the first ranking, but I think probably due to the ease of understanding it and the conspicuity of the World's Fair, it stuck. So even now today, even though the world has changed and there are some chateaux whose fortunes have risen and some whose fortunes have fallen, I think people still often look to the 1855 classification. Saint-Julien has no first growths. And, sometimes I think people can gravitate towards regions, appellations, where there are those, very famous, lofty first growths. And Saint-Julien sometimes I think can get a little bit lost in the shuffle there. But Saint-Julien has 11 classified growths. It's not a big appellation. It's a little over 900 hectares. So, to put that in context, it's only a little bit bigger than Pomerol. It's about 2/3 the size of Margaux. So, it's a reasonably small appellation. The 11 classified growths own now about 90% of the area under vine.
Wow, I didn't know
and
that.
It's a really high proportion. All right? It's a really high proportion, particularly in contrast to appellations like Saint-Estèphe, where the 5 classified growths own the minority of the area under vine. Right. And these 11 classified growths, even though there's no first growth, are all simultaneously, maybe for the first time in their history, making wine at or, essentially in discussion with their own personal best simultaneously. The value is extraordinary. The terroir really shines through. So it doesn't matter if you're only interested in drinking the best of the best. You should be looking at Saint-Julien for some of that. It doesn't matter if you're a young collector who says, look, I'm really value-oriented. You need to be paying attention to Saint-Julien, right? So with that expressiveness of its own terroir, which is nuanced and interesting, and, such a uniformly super high level of quality, Saint-Julien shouldn't be, put in the corner. It's not second to any other appellation. Just because it doesn't have first growths doesn't mean that it doesn't produce first growth caliber wine. It does.
Yeah. There's always the debate about the 1855 classification, how relevant it is today. But I can't imagine them ever. I mean, you look what happened in Saint-Emilion just recently, where every 10 years they were doing it, and now people have dropped out of it. That's a whole separate conversation. But do you ever think they'll review and make any further changes to the 1855 classification?
So are you familiar with the 1961 attempt to do that?
I'm not super familiar with that.
There was a discussion in 1961 to reclassify properties. But there were sort of just as many people who felt, I think, that they had something to lose than something to gain. And it was internally decided that that would not move forward. I think that Baron Philippe de Rothschild, who was interested in, understandably, promoting Mouton from a second to a first, had some involvement with that. But of course, in 1973, he got his way, and Mouton was promoted. If I recall correctly, I think Jacques Chirac was actually the Minister of Agriculture at the time and had a hand in that too. So, as you totally rightly point out, the attempts to redo classifications have run into some really serious problems. Has it done the consumer any good? I'm not sure that it really has. I think that it's all the more reason for people to buy a great book about Saint-Julien and educate themselves.
Totally agree. And the other thing that struck me about Saint-Julien, so thank you for the introduction to Nicolas Sinoquet from Garard Larose, who I didn't know, who I interviewed last week. And he said something that really struck me, that Saint-Julien is populated with people who just get on with it and don't need to make noise. And to me, your book seems like a love letter exactly to that sensibility.
100%. It's full of people who are so dedicated to what they're doing, who have such savoir-faire, who have such passion for what they're doing. And, you mentioned earlier, sometimes the challenge that Bordeaux generally has in communicating with the wine lover who may not know their wines well. But a lot of the people in Saint-Julien are just humble. They're lovely people who really care about what they're doing, but they're not out there to, try and make their brand sort of the next luxury brand or something along those lines. They really want to make beautiful wine. They want to put their all into it. And they really want to transmit their terroir to you via the bottle. And I totally agree with what Nicolas said. I mean, he's a great example of it. And the whole team at Grual de Rose, amazing people working very quietly to do something extraordinary.
Yeah, and look, I visited Saint-Julien many times, and I visited Grual de Rose, but I credit you for bringing it much more on my radar than it had been, because maybe they're doing it too quietly. Right? They are doing exciting stuff, but maybe, and they shouldn't be bling super fancy, but maybe they need to could make a little more noise about it. One other really interesting thing from the book, which you started out with is Bruno Borie and Ducru, when he asked you whether he wanted the short tour or the long tour, which I could so hear Bruno say that. I mean, that is so Bruno, because he's so passionate about everything he does. And of course you took the long tour, but I'm curious, what does the long tour mean to you as a philosophy?
The long tour means, beyond sort of the superficial stats, asking why and how, and being exposed to new ideas, and being able to change your mind when you hear something. I was talking to someone recently about oak. And the general trend in Bordeaux is that the wines are less oaky than they were. So there are some people, and, I say this specifically because we're giving, Bruno's an example where we talk about the percentage oak, and whereas many places the percentage of new oak during the élevage has decreased over time, it's still 100% at Ducru-Beaucaillou. So if you're someone who doesn't love the taste of new oak, you might look at that factoid and say, I don't like that they're doing that. But go talk to Bruno. Say, well, why are you using 100% new oak? And he has his reasons. The sanitary reasons, the porosity of it. You say, well, what do you think about oaky ones? Well, okay, we use a lower toast. We actually air dry our staves. It used to be 5 or 6 years. Now it's as long as 7 years that the staves are air dried before the cooper makes them into barrels. So there are all of these additional nuances and the whys, the opportunity to find out something that wasn't on your radar and to have your own assumptions questioned. That's the long tour. That's what that's about.
That's so well explained. In the book, I know you have tasting notes going back to 1922. You have 55, you have 45, you have 61, which I was so happy to see. Yeah. There's lots of people who haven't tasted older wines like that. And sometimes they're really surprised even that these wines can be so beautiful. What do these old bottles tell you that recent vintages can't?
One of the things that really interested me in working on the book with a scientific approach is to try and address the different variables. That's right. Yeah. I mean, I'm incapable of sort of leaving that at the door. And there are lots of good questions about, well, how do you know that it isn't just the influence of the person who's making the wine, or some trend or some style that's in vogue, or these things that have a time window on them. So if you really go back as far as you can tasting these wines, and in particular tasting them in horizontals, so, a tasting where you have multiple chateaux of the same vintage, can you differentiate the Ducru-Beaucaillou from the Bechevel in 2016? Can you differentiate the Ducru-Beaucaillou from the Bechevel in 1929?
Oh, that's great.
And I think it's only by looking really far back that you can control for the variable of the attitude of the person who made the wine, some style of the time, and there are different styles. Properties have their ups and their downs, and everyone has their, really star-studded periods, and there are ones that are more challenging for various reasons. And so the idea with the really old tasting notes wasn't to say, oh, look at all these beautiful old wines that I have in my cellar, had in my cellar because I drank them now. Right. It's really for an academic purpose of being able to ask the question of what is the true personality of the terroir when you change everything else over time, the terroir being that constant that hasn't changed. And I think I've been, really astounded. I'm not saying the blind tasting is easier, that I get everything right all the time. I loved you in a podcast, you referenced the late Michael Broadbent saying, the best way to do well in a blind tasting is to have a look in the kitchen beforehand. It's hard. But I have been really surprised in these blind tastings, the personality that these terroirs have. The success with which you can say, that one is the Gros de Rose. That one's the Becherel. And I think that that's a real benefit. That led me to really think, as we're in this interesting period in the wine world now, looking forward to some of the challenges of the future, which include, but are surely not limited to, magnification of challenges that we face now with evolution and climate and things along those lines. To be able to talk to people about what they're excited about, what they're worried about, what their plans are, and conversely, to really look back in time so that when I taste 1961, 1929, 40, whatever the lofty vintage is, to be able to think, well, why does it taste that way? Why was it like that? Why was it a great period? Why was it a bad period? The old Cox and Ferret can actually be really helpful with that, referencing and, for anyone who's not familiar with them, since 1850, a book called Cox and Ferret has been periodically released that catalogs, many of, if not all of the Chateau in Bordeaux. It's a huge region, including things like, how's the wine performing? They have their own sort of classification, as it were, who comes first among the second growth, so on and so forth. What's the volume of wine they're making? What's been going on? And I think that really understanding why great periods have been great in the past and why challenging periods have been challenging has added to my own appreciation of the wines. And it's made me much more curious and much more open-minded as we move to the future to be able to approach these current questions armed with lessons from, previous challenges.
I love that in your book you have chapters looking back for each winery and looking forward. It's a really interesting structure. And to me, as I was reading, I was thinking this is almost a commitment that the book will age. It'll become a historical document. Was that intentional?
It became intentional. Yeah. So when it started, I was sort of compiling my own fact sheet of all of the things that I thought were variables for each chateau. As I did that and started to look back in these beautiful old books, which certainly not limited to Cox and Ferret, Edmund Penning Rossel has these beautiful old books going back to 1969, and many among them, Bernard Ginestè's series in the 1980s, fabulous books, and having to cobble together the bits and pieces of what made the 49s so special and the 59s. I mean, it's hard. There's a lot of this information. And when you talk to people at the chateau, some of the things that are passed on from generation to generation, after a couple of generations, get lost. And if nobody writes these things down, they're going to get lost.
Because people think it stays forever, but it doesn't unless it's written down.
Exactly. So, it became the sort of document as well that I hope that, when I'm gone and my daughter tastes something from my cellar and says, wow, that 2016 is so good and it's so different from what I'm tasting in, 2066 or, whenever that is. Hopefully I'm still here in 2066.
Keep drinking wine and you will.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Listen to Laura Catena.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
I'm hopeful that it'll sort of be a signpost for her. And one of the things that's made me most proud, that's really warmed my heart the most, is that people in Saint-Julien have really seemed to recognize that too. And some of the nicest feedback that I've had is from the winemakers who I interviewed, who got to look at the book and read the book and say, this is fantastic. This is not only interesting to, have this conversation and learn what my neighbor said to you, but to be able to transmit this to the general public, which, I think actually we talked about before, that link that needs to be solidified. And I hope that in some small way, and I hope it's not immodest to say, but I hope that the book helps to fill that link. So few people, even who want to visit, have the chance to visit.
Yeah.
And when they do, so often, it's with a tour guide or someone who's knowledgeable. But the heart of that long tour is the question, okay, that's what you do. Why? Why do you do that? How do you do that? You're going to continue doing that? How long have you been doing that? Why did you start? And I hope that the book helps to build that link between the drinker and the person who pours everything that he or she has into making it.
And for listeners who don't know, Bordeaux is a 2-hour train ride from Paris these days. It's incredibly easy to get to. So talking about visiting Bordeaux, there's no excuse anymore not to do it. Marc, it's really a beautiful book. As I showed here on the screen, I'm going to try, I don't know, hopefully it'll work to show it this way. It's just a random picture I opened up to of Bruno, but that really was random. Highly recommend anyone who's at all interested in learning more about wine to check out this book. It's really, really fantastic, and I've really enjoyed reading it. Hi, listeners. I'm very excited to offer you all a 15% discount on the book Saint-Julien if you're interested in buying it. All you have to do is in the promo code, put the word uncorking to get your discount. The link will be in the show notes, but remember, just put the word uncorking in the promo code. There's always standard closing questions that I ask everyone. I'd love to hear from you as well. So the first one is, please share an early wine memory that drew you into wine.
There was a dinner that my dad's best friend organized when I was a kid. And
how old?
I don't remember, 13, something like that. And so, I got to smell the wine. I had my own glass. I got to have a little taste.
Yep.
I don't remember what the wine was, but my dad leaned over in the middle of dinner and he said, "Remember what this smells like. Remember what it tastes like. This is great Bordeaux." I wish I knew what it was. He doesn't remember, and neither does Shep. So, that factoid is like, but it doesn't matter either.
Doesn't matter.
And I remember what it tasted like. And that was so special for me. And, I had another similar experience at Oxford where I'm sure I've lost the notes. I don't know what the wine was. But to have two wines in front of you from the same appellation, which I do think was Saint-Julien, actually, and to think, not only are these great, but how could they be so different? It grabbed me, and it's never let go.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And can you share a breakout moment in your wine career when you knew that really you're doing something special?
I think the moment when I knew that I was doing something special is when I started getting the drafts back from the people who I was interviewing at the château. And when they said, "This is great. Nobody's written something like this. This needs to exist. Thank you for doing this." It was then and has really remained an emotional thing. And there are so many friendships which have come from the book. And really, being able to have a two-way street where people have expressed, their gratitude and their admiration. I don't mean to seem, immodest. That's meant a huge amount to me. And that's when I knew, it wasn't on Instagram or, when I reached a certain number of followers. It was when somebody said, "This really needs to exist, and we're glad that you're doing it." I felt like I was doing justice to their hard work and to something that needs to be done.
And you succeeded. And what's your next book, actually? Have you decided what the next one will be?
Yes, so both Saint-Estèphe and Pauillac are underway. And the Grand Cru Classé are so numerous in Pauillac that it may be 2 books, not 1.
Oh.
And so, the exact timing of what will come out when, I haven't entirely sorted that out, but they're both in really good shape and undergoing some revisions and things like that, even beyond just doing the interviews, which I love. And there's a lot of just sitting and thinking.
Yeah.
And trying to let my own thoughts coalesce, looking at my own tasting notes, reading back through these, wonderful primary sources going back so far.
And my final question, please share one piece of advice for someone who feels they don't belong in wine.
Everybody belongs in wine. Everybody belongs in wine. I understand that the wine world can seem daunting. That sometimes it can seem like, it's the domain of a select group of people. But there's something out there for everybody. There's, nowadays, more than ever, there's no barrier to information. And I think that anyone who's interested in wine and passionate about wine, particularly with social media, can connect with other people who are interested in and passionate about wine. It's something that can really amplify the hobby. The French have such wonderful phrases for all sorts of things, right? Bien-être, well-being, right? L'art de vivre, right? The art of living well.
Yeah.
And, I think wine is really part of that. So, if you are a person who eats dinner, you are a person who deserves to have, a nice bottle of wine there, if you want it to be.
And it doesn't need to be expensive.
It doesn't need to be expensive. And if you've tasted that bottle of wine, then you're allowed to have an opinion about that bottle of wine. And, it's one thing. I think people can confuse things that are statements that need to be factually accurate to reflect, reality and the work that's been done, right? When you're talking about someone else's work, you don't want to misportray that. But so much of enjoying wine is just about your experience of enjoying it or not enjoying it. And there's nobody who can tell you that, you're wrong about your appreciation or experience with a wine. So it's a big tent. I think everybody is really welcome in the wine world. And what I find is that, as intimidating as it can seem, wine clubs with medallions and songs and, all this stuff, right? When you get talking to someone who is a wine lover, buckle your seatbelt. You could be there forever. When sometimes people, I love it, by the way. I love it when people come up to me on the street or in the cheese shop or in a tasting and something like that. And half the time, I get to yammering away. And I think, geez, were they prepared for this?
They just want to acknowledge you. Yeah.
Everybody is welcome. It seems intimidating, but people are lovely.
Yeah, totally agree. Marc, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for this beautiful book you've put together. Thank you for all the hard work for so long you've done to increase the tent of wine that people stand under. I greatly appreciate it, and I think many people in the wine industry do as well. So thank you very much.
Jeff, thank you so much for your kind words. It's always a pleasure to talk to someone who's read the book or, has seen what I'm doing on Instagram, where I feel like they really get it. And it's just a joy to be able to communicate these things that I'm passionate about. And likewise, thank you so much for doing this wonderful podcast. I love it as a fan. I enjoy it. So it's really an extra special treat to be a guest.
Oh, that's great. I'm having so much fun with the podcast and really getting to talk to people and learn more about people. It's really been a lot of work, but a lot of pleasure as well. So thank you so much. Thank you.
My pleasure.
I, Jeff Zacharia, am the producer of this podcast. I want to thank everyone who's helped make it possible. My good friend, Christian Kuipers, for the artwork. My daughter by choice, Hannah Tobias, for the music. Soraya Perry for the editing. Amelia Lankus for the social media and communications. And of course, my wife, Frederique, for her constant and continued support. Thank you.